Welcome back to Deep Tissue Talks. I want to talk to you about a side of the pain that nobody talks about, the spiritual pain. In the last bonus episode, we touched on the somatic and the mechanical side of pain. Today, we're going to talk about what is spiritual pain and how I treat it. I'm not going to re-explain the impact and the reason why we have somatic or mechanical pain. If you need a refresher, just go back to the bonus episode called The 3 Layers of Pain. But yeah, you're probably asking yourself, what does spirituality has to do with pain? How do I know that the pain is spiritual, and what are the symptoms per se, and how can it be treated? Let's peel back the layers even further. I want to share with you how I stumbled upon what I now recognize as spiritual pain. To be honest, discovering that third layer wasn't something I thought out intentionally. I think that it found me. My training in manual therapy mostly focused on the mechanical side of the pain, the biomechanical part of the pain. And for a long time, that's what I focused on because that's what I knew, that's what I studied. It was the most tangible, the easiest to discuss too, especially in a world that's filled with professional athletes. I would treat the body by looking at the posture, what's overused, muscle tightness, and then move on. That was my comfort zone. And then eventually, as I was maturing as a human being, I started dipping my toes into the somatic side. I started to explore the emotional root of pain. And I'm going to admit at first, I did it cautiously. You see, in the pro sport world, talking about emotions, trauma, or energy might get you labeled as woo woo. So I was trying to find subtle ways to introduce the idea, almost in secret. I'd ask a player or a client questions that led them to their own conclusion. It let them realize that their pain was more than just a muscle knot. It was also about their emotion, their mindset, and that worked. But then the spiritual side of the pain came knocking at my door. And this was an entirely new ball game. You know, I'm an atheist, but I was raised Catholic. And those teaching, they gave me a deep respect for all religions. It gave me a foundation of openness. But over time, I came to believe that the divine, the sacred, isn't necessarily external. It can be in us, in our capacity to love, connect, and heal. I remember the first time I recognized spiritual pain in a player. It was just a regular session. It was a basketball player, someone who was dealing with chronic pain. We'd address his mechanical issue. You know, I adjust the posture, I worked through his muscle tension, would even explore some somatic elements by discussing the mental strain of competing at a such high level. But something still wasn't right. During one of our sessions, something shifted. I could feel it. It wasn't in his muscle or his mindset. He opened up about a loss he'd suffered, something he'd never shared before. It wasn't just the emotional grief that caught my attention, but the way his body seemed to physically respond to this deeper layer of pain. It was as his discomfort and his tightness was anchored in something beyond the physical and beyond the emotional. I realized at that moment that his pain wasn't just about a misaligned bone, an overused muscle chain, or stress from the game. It was tied to something bigger, something that connected his physical body to his spirit, to the unresolved energy of his grief. So I stopped the session and we just talked. No technique, no muscle work, just an open conversation about what he was holding on to. And in that space, healing began. Truth be told, I had no idea what I was doing. I just followed my instinct. I invited him to take a deep breath, and we started a guided breathing exercise. I put my hands over his chest and I cupped his neck with my other hand, a little bit like a Reiki practitioner would do. I asked him to choose a color that reminded him of the person he lost. He chose the color blue. Blue is an interesting color because metaphysically it represents calm, peace, and spiritual truth. It's tied to the throat chakra, and the throat chakra governs self-expression and communication, the very thing we often lose in grief. Neither of us knew this at the time, but it's beautiful to reflect on the choices we make when we just follow our intuition or when we follow a feeling, this gut feeling sometimes. His choice seemed so simple yet so profound. It's like if the blue he picked carried unspoken messages of healing and hope. It was just perfectly aligned with what he needed at the time. I asked him to inhale the blue color to feel his lungs and his body, and then exhale slowly. I wanted him to visualize the grief, the heaviness leaving his body. With each exhale, I could feel the tension under my palm begin to shift. His muscles started to kind of melt under my fingers. And his rib cage, which had been locked and rigid, started to move more freely. It looked like it was being able to handle more air. As we continued, I noticed his body react in a way I hadn't quite experienced before. His shoulders trembled slightly, and a ripple of energy seemed to just course through his spine. He started to breathe way deeply, and tears streamed down his face. It was as if years of unexpressed emotions were being released in that moment. I just stayed with him and I just was feeling empathetic. I felt like an energy support. I was there kind of like a witness of his healing. We talked about it later on. I wanted to know, how the session was for him. I wanted to understand what he felt, how he felt it. I was curious. I've never seen that before. He told me that he felt a warmth radiating across his back, almost like a comforting embrace, like a hug. And he said that a sensation of lightness did spread through his chest. He felt like a weight lifted off his heart. He told me, yeah, I've never felt so free. It was a moment of profound vulnerability where the healing extended far beyond muscles and tissues. His body had physically responded to the release and his spirit had begun to heal. The power of breath work combined with intentional touch and then a space for grief allowed him to feel that warmth, that long forgotten lightness, as if he had been given permission to finally let go. That's how I realized that spiritual pain does exist. It reveals itself in those deeper layers where words and technique aren't enough. Sometimes healing involves tapping into an inner part of ourselves we don't often acknowledge, the part that is connected to our greater purpose, to our spirit, whatever that means for each individual. The key in that moment and in that work is to accept being vulnerable, to surrender to the unknown, to trust at that particular moment that you know what you think you don't know. When I do soft tissue work, the body need to surrender to my hand. And in a similar way, here the body needed to surrender to the spirit, to the grief. It's giving me chills because I feel emotional just thinking about it, reliving that experience. I was a witness, but in some way, his healing healed me too. And I'm a firm believer that if we take care of ourselves, we can heal people that don't even know us. And that's a beautiful way to think about this universal consciousness that we are probably all a part of. So, yeah, now the question that you might have is, how do I recognize that I have a pain that's spiritual versus a somatic pain? Well, somatic pain often has a clear physical origin, a connection to our emotion and our mindset. It's a pain that's linked to how the body hold onto stress, onto unresolved feelings or trauma. For example, if you experience neck tension from grinding your teeth, if it's a somatic pain, it could be due to anxiety or a heavy, tight feeling in your chest when you're nervous. That's somatic pain. It's your body's way of telling you and expressing what your mind is dealing with. So just ask yourself, does this pain worsen with emotional stress, or when I think about that moment, or when I'm with those people? Is it tied to specific memories or repetitive negative thoughts? If the answer is yes, it's likely somatic. If the answer is no, then you have to dig deeper. Spiritual pain, on the other hand, is more elusive. It can feel like an emptiness, a heaviness in your heart, or a deep sense of disconnection. This type of pain often surfaces when there are wounds or unresolved energy in your spirit, like a grief, a sense of purposelessness, or a spiritual crisis. Spiritual pain isn't necessarily connected to muscles or stress. It often feels as if something vital is missing or out of balance, out of harmony with your life, with your greater purpose. So to recognize it, you could ask yourself, does this pain, is this feeling tied to something greater? Is it tied to a loss? And not necessarily loss of a person, loss of a job, the loss of the will to live your life, to get out of the house. Does this pain lift or feels better when I engage in meaningful spiritual practice like meditation, breath work? So understanding the difference between the two means tuning into your inner self. If your pain feels persistent, despite addressing it with physical or emotional treatment, it may be a sign to explore its spiritual roots. Both types of pain are valid and they deserve attention, but they require different approach for healing. Please note that this is not a diagnosis or a substitute for professional medical advice. Always consult with a doctor or a qualified healthcare provider for any pain or health concern. This is simply an additional tool to help you explore and understand your pain on a deeper level. Thank you for listening to Deep Tissue Talk. Stay tuned for a new episode on Wednesday. In the meantime, I send you love.